Welcome everyone. We're going to start the webinar soon. Great to have you as we continue the celebration of International Women's Day. I ask you all just to jump on the chat button and make sure that you're saying hello to each other and saying hello to us and telling us where you're from. In particular, make sure when you do use the chat button, pick up both panelists and attendees. And don't forget that all attendees have been muted during the presentation, and just use the chat button to communicate. And also that we're all being recorded, and this will be made available after today's session. So let's get started. Kia ora, tina koko, tina koko, tina koko katoa. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. They're the traditional custodians of the land in which I present today. And in celebration of International Women's Day, I pay my respects to all Aboriginal women, elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples today. We have over 150 people registered, and you've all come together to celebrate International Women's Day and also celebrate the achievements and our strive for equality. The International Women's Day theme feels a little bit different for me this year. I'm feeling really optimistic and I'm really empowered by this theme, Choose to Challenge, because I believe challenging is vital. We all can choose to call out gender bias and inequality. And I'm really delighted to be joined by our panellists today to discuss the challenges and how we choose to challenge in 2021 and beyond. And the other morning, I woke up to the news on the radio. And the first story on the news was of Federal Australian Minister, Government Minister, and rape allegations. And following a previous alleged rape within Parliament and subsequently shining a light on the toxic culture within the Australian Federal Parliament, there's particularly a lot of that culture, particularly proving to be very hostile towards women. The second news story that featured were reports of sexual harassment by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, off the back of the Me Too movement that started over 4 years ago. And the third story that morning, and this was only last week, how quickly news changes, the third story was about Buckingham Palace plans to investigate bullying claims made against Meghan Markle. It really made me think, particularly as we approached International Women's Day, whether it be allegation, rumour, truth, or whatever the facts of the story, how much sexual violence against and aggression against women still exist. How many of our sisters across the globe are still not treated equally. And this is despite the efforts of our foremothers in the 60s and the 70s, despite the Me Too movement. The dial just does not seem to be shifting. And why do those in a position of power continue to abuse their power through acts of aggression and social domination over women? And right or wrong, I use the example of Meghan Markle to say, would she be receiving this same treatment if she was not a woman? While I am frustrated, I'm frustrated that we haven't seen such a shift on the dial. I am holding my optimism. As I said, this theme this year feels really different, and I feel like we've got an opportunity for change, and we all have the power to do something about any inequality. We can choose to challenge. Let us discover how we can do that and much more with three passionate, motivating and influential women. I'm delighted to have with us today. I welcome Kristal Kinsela, who is a well-known businesswoman and entrepreneur who works across Australia as a highly regarded and skilled facilitator and expert in stakeholder engagement and project management, and a multi-award winner Kristal's been awarded the 2019 Indigenous Defence Leader of the Year Award, the 2017 New South Wales Aboriginal Woman of the Year, and the 2017 Supplier Diversity Advocate of the Year, recognised for her outstanding contribution in working with Indigenous communities, Indigenous businesses, and leaders and women across Australia. I'd now like to welcome Tanya Harris. Tanya is a senior leader with almost 20 years experience in the private sector, 7 years in international development and 13 years embedding sustainability into procurement and broader organisational operations. She's just joined Edge Environment, a specialist sustainability advisory company, as their senior consultant. Welcome. And Lisa Strickland. She is an inspiring and upcoming millennial Samoan procurement leader. She's half Samoan and a quarter New Zealand, European and Spanish. She was recently awarded the New Zealand Procurement Excellence Awards, the Young Procurement Professional of the Year for 2020. Lisa is currently the Principal Procurement Specialist at the Ministry of Education in New Zealand. Welcome, team. Great to have you here. So let's get started. So to kick off the questioning today, I'm going to start with one simple question. Where would I find you on a Saturday morning at 10 a.m? And Lisa, I'm going to start the conversation today with you. As I understand, in your free time, you do a lot of volunteering in refugee support, helping families starting again. So I can't imagine you get much time on the weekend, but tell us, where are you on a Saturday at 10 a.m?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say, malola se fua mawai leo mai mua, e mua na si ile biinga, male whawhatai lea tua mo le nei aso matungo fie. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm so honoured to be on this panel. But yeah, to answer your question, on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, I've probably been awake for the last 6 hours with my 5-month-old, and I'd probably be out walking my 2 golden retrievers with baby in hand as well. So yeah, and lovely Saturday morning. I love my Saturday mornings.
Lovely. Juggling it all. Thank you and welcome. Tanya, where will we find you on a Saturday morning?
Oh, well, I'm not a superwoman, so I'm not juggling quite that much. And if I'm lucky, I'm quite infamous for not being a morning person. So if I am out of bed, finished my cuppa and reading the ABC online, I'm either in my veggie patch. Right now, my tomato harvest needs to happen every day. I've got tomatoes coming out of everywhere, or maybe at the markets, you know, local produce markets, having a cream cheese bagel.
Oh, sounds lovely. And Kristal, what about yourself?
Thanks so much, Sharon. And I'm joining you from Beer Pie Country. I just want to give a big shout out to the traditional owners here who allow me to live and work on their beautiful country. I have a 2-year-old, so you might find me at the beach trying to tire him out because, you know, nap time's a little bit after that. If I'm not at the beach, I may be at Bunnings because I'm doing what most people did through COVID, renovate my house.
Oh, thank you. I think I'm with you at Bunnings. Terrific. Well, welcome. As mentioned in my introduction, I've come to this year's International Women's Day with that sense of optimism, and something really does feel different to me. And ironically, I've spent the previous decade leading women members and fundraising for women's cancers, and really feeling empowered and active and making a difference. But now I feel like there's something different happening. So I'm feeling really optimistic about where this conversation is going to take. But of course, we need to address the challenges. And perhaps the feeling has come about because across the globe, we're realising the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities between women and men, and in almost all areas of all of life between men and women is quite different. And so women are falling behind with regards to gender equality, and suddenly it's now on the agenda of all organisations, because you know what, they can't ignore it. So I think that's probably one positive thing that's come out of the pandemic. So let's explore why days like International Women's Day are important. And I'm saying that question out the start because I'd love everybody to put in their comments, the audience, to say, why is International Women's Day important to you? But let's start with Tanya. Why do you think International Women's Day is important?
Well, for me, not that I'm not optimistic, but I do continue to find it really frustrating that we are having this conversation in 2021. And gender equity, equality, opportunity and bias should be something that's just logic, common sense and integrated. But I think that Grace Tame, I don't know if any of you have seen any of her speeches in the last week, but particularly the one at the UN Women event on Friday was very raw. And her key point around continuing the conversation and ensuring that we normalise our experiences and our responses to those experiences, and ensuring that we don't keep you know, the bad bits in the closet. If it comes out, if it's normalised, if we have more conversations around responses, behaviour, then that allows us to shift from, you know, almost burying it to talking about what are solutions, what are responses that have worked, and actually sharing and collaborating. But you know, on the flip side, I think it's wonderful to have new inspiring women's accomplishments and stories shared to be able to help motivate us and to continue that conversation in a positive spin as well. So I'm very passionate about International Women's Day. I think it's really important, and I'm glad that we have an annual event, because if we're not talking about progress and we're not monitoring it, it's easy for the momentum to disappear.
Thanks, Tanya. And, you know, tragically, the toxic culture that we're seeing come out of federal parliament has put the conversation out there, and we can't avoid talking about it now. So thanks for your response. Kristal, in September 2019, you were recognised as one of Australia's Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence. You've been a finalist in the Women's Agenda. In 2017, the Agenda's Setter of the Year, and you were featured in the Agenda 30, an e-book highlighting 30 women redefining businesses in 2018. I'd love to hear your take on International Women's Day.
I kind of sit on the fence a little bit at times, because, you know, you can have that view of, do we need just one day to recognise and shine a light on women's achievements and to call out inequality? But then the flip side of it, just as Tanya said, it is a great opportunity for us to hear more stories, to reach out, to recognise some women that may not necessarily get a voice at different times of the year, and to continuing, you know, turning up and, you know, raising awareness about our plight. So, you know, I see the event continuing to grow, and I see the themes continuing to give us some inspiration. And yeah, I don't know. This year's been a little bit different for me. Like I feel, I don't know, I guess just where I'm at and with everything going on, it hasn't had that same momentum as it has in previous years. I'd have to be really honest to say that.
Really interesting. Lisa, tell us why you think it's important.
You know, what's not amazing about having forums like this and bringing us all here together to, you know, discuss people of all backgrounds, ages and genders, and how we can make the world more equal. So I think, like Tanya and Kristal said, there's an amazing platform for us all to not only celebrate our achievements, but also to discuss the continuous challenges we all face. So yeah, it's really important to me.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Lisa. And Joe Bailey says on the comments, yes, it's allowing opportunity, at least annually, to raise awareness, report the status of change, and to see what progress is being made. So thanks for sharing.
If I could just also, I must neglect, we must not neglect the fact that it also allows men's participation in the conversation. And through that celebration and also through that engagement, obviously they're an essential part of the solution. So it allows that kind of safe space to be able to positively engage instead of feeling like this could be something that might be a challenging discussion for them to participate in.
You're absolutely right, Tanya, and we should acknowledge that, because I think the Champion of Change initiative is a fantastic initiative, and this is a human rights issue. Inequality is human rights, so it's all of our responsibility. So thank you for raising that. Kristal, we're going to focus on inequality now. Have you experienced inequality, and sort of what have you done to challenge or overcome it?
Where do I begin, Sharon? Firstly, I'm young, I'm Black, and I'm a woman. I've experienced my whole life, and in different realms, if I could say. I mean, if I think about in growing up as a young Aboriginal woman, the unconscious bias and the challenges that I've faced from, you know, people presuming, you know, what I know and what I can do. From participating in a male-dominated sport. I was an Olympic freestyle wrestler for 10 years, which is, you know, heavily male-dominated, and a lot of people don't even know that the sport exists for women. And you know, such differences in the way that I was treated and you know, excluded in lots of respects. Around that. And then I'm also a domestic violence survivor of 3 times in my life. So I, you know, continue, I guess, to push forward. The way that I've challenged and I continue to overcome these inequalities is really to advocate and speak up, to reach my arms around the sisterhood, other women, and to help them rise. I think being a success is the greatest way to overcome inequality, by stepping out and stepping up and really breaking through the ceiling and continuing to push forward. Every time I reach a new height, I make sure that I turn around and I bring the women behind me all the way. And I think that's what continues to push us through as well.
And it was touched on earlier about how important it is to have the conversation. It sounds like that also helped you on your journey as well, having that conversation and raising awareness.
Most definitely. And having you have to have a sisterhood around you. You have to have other women that you know and trust, that you support, they support you, because it's that strength in understanding along the way that really helps elevate.
Thank you. Tanya, how do we stop gender bias? How are we going to do it?
Well, obviously, I haven't come up with exactly the right solution, because we are talking about it today. But I think that what Kristal mentioned around unconscious bias, I found I had the opportunity to do unconscious bias training at work when I was at the Fred Hollows Foundation, and I found it absolutely fascinating to understand how much unconscious bias I personally had. And until you actually start with self, it's really hard to change your language, because inclusive language is another opportunity to address bias, though perhaps not really directly, but we start with self. So engaging with your L&D, learning and development team internally, if you don't already have unconscious bias training, I highly recommend it. I found it really insightful, and it did lead to change in conversation and behaviour and approach within the workplace, which I thought was great, though it was a very heavily skewed female workplace. I think that, language, mindfulness and inclusive language, how we interact with others, so again, starting with self, is really important. The whole inclusion with men and having champions of change and actually having that two-way conversation is really helpful, but also understanding that we can be a little defensive, or our stories are raw. So it can make other people uncomfortable when we share those. So giving people a safe space to be able to absorb and process. You know, calling it out. I've been, you know, like all of us, we've all experienced bias and discrimination. And often it's somebody else, it's easier for somebody else to be able to call it out than you as you're experiencing it. So being that person that can articulate thoughtfully, going, well, I didn't think that was okay, or to be able to redirect the conversation when you're in the middle of it, I think that's really helpful, and that's a fantastic role to play for somebody that might not have the confidence to be able to call it out themselves as they're experiencing it. And the whole sharing of stories, you know, bias is something that until you actually point it out and you change the perspective, or you give your perspective, it's really hard if people aren't walking in your shoes to understand how you're feeling. So by having the courage to share your stories and to be mindful of the language, so that, you know, a little bit like how we practice with our partners, if you've got a partner, it's not an attack and you don't use you and you start with I. Those types of things actually are really helpful in a workplace as well. Yeah. But obviously I don't have all the answers. And I think that, you know, personalities do attract it. Stronger female personalities tend to attract a little bit more of an abrasive response. And we don't need to apologise for that, but there are different tactics to be able to harness your passion and your energy, so that it can not deflect, but to change that conversation and the experiences that you're having in the workplace. Lean on your network, and have mentors, people within the workplace as well as external. You know, they're all really, really helpful tips. But yeah, I do apologise that I haven't quite solved this one yet.
But you touched on language, and that is just so significant, that part. You know, I even think about, you know, I used to say to my niece, oh, she's so gorgeous, you're so pretty, you're so this, you're so that, you know, using that real feminine language. And then you kind of have to stop yourself and go, hang on, why wouldn't I say that to a little boy? Like, you really have to consciously do that. So I do think education in this space is significant, because we don't even know we're saying it. We grow up with this language, and we have no idea how offensive or how gender specific it can be.
Absolutely. And I mean, I must admit, every time it's a red button for me. Every time I see somebody talking about woke lefty language, well, I'm sorry, but I think that dignity, equity, and respect is not woke and lefty. I think that's just fundamental. So, you know, education and language both go very well together, but also in recognition of the difference now with what I'm seeing, you know, late 40s, with what my my younger female colleagues at work, and how they straight away call it out, like the difference with what I think is the norm, because that's what I've been used to. And when they call it out, and it's actually helping me learn and continue to grow around, you know, equity and inclusion, because I've got these young lasses that are going, that's not okay. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. You are absolutely correct, but it didn't occur to me. So I really like the evolution and that continuous learning, because of the age differences and the progress that we are making.
Thanks, Tanya. We've got some great comments coming through on the chat. Georgina says, I think International Women's Day is also an opportunity with our younger women girls to empower them to sharing their experiences, sharing their voice, and this has come through a lot, enabling them to celebrate women and our achievements and raise awareness on the issues around the world for girls and women. Really important point. Thanks, Georgina. Okay, Lisa, tell us why diversity is important from your context.
Yeah, well, you know, diversity is so important, not only because it means, you know, diverse ideas, diverse viewpoints or diverse discussions. You know, we have a greater range to talent, we have better decisions, and obviously increase innovation through that diversity. And that's just not my opinion, you know, that's the position that's largely been born out of research, which also shows that boards with females and with diverse ethnicities in general are more effective, more successful, and more profitable. But, you know, I'd like to think now that we have sort of gone past that discussion around diversity and moving into the inclusion space, you know, because yes, diversity is like incredibly important. And we do want to ensure that like diverse individuals and their ideas and opinions are included. But diversity asks how many voices are in the room. And what we probably should be more asking is what inclusion would say, which is how many voices are being heard. And if we go even further than that, equity asks, you know, whose voice is being taken seriously or not being taken seriously because they're the minority. So yeah, I think whilst diversity is so important, there's I'd like to know that we know that now, right? We know that society knows this. We need to know this, and we need to move into how we're including these diverse peoples in our discussions and valuing their opinions as well.
Do you find, because you work for the public sector, the government organisations, do you find that they've got it right, particularly in New Zealand, from a diversity inclusion point of view?
I have to say, I worked in a couple of different government organisations, and they couldn't be more different. So I think it definitely depends on the makeup of the government department that you're working for. I've worked in a very male-dominated place like the Defence Force, and I'm currently working for the Ministry of Education. So you can imagine education, you know, based on history, has a lot of female employees. So it's hugely different. And then private sector's got another whole ball game again, which I'm sure you are well aware of.
Long way to go. Thank you, Lisa. Alan has made a comment on the chat bar. International Women's Day is great for me, as I would love to see women at the top of a company's trees. This is where I can see the main issue. I think there's a lot of veiled bias in Australia and the world. Women shouldn't need to be tough to be at the top. Go Kristal, an Indigenous woman leading. Marvellous achievement. Thanks, Alan, for your contribution. And Kristal, I'll go to you now. You're passionate about creating lasting pathways and growing capabilities of Indigenous businesses and through individuals. And you've contributed to Aboriginal business development and also business and government procurement. And you've written and published the first book in Australia on supplier diversity and Indigenous business procurement, entitled Supplier Diversity How. So with regards to supplier diversity and Indigenous business procurement, and in the context, great, you'll have to put that up a bit higher. Just, there we go. Supplier diversity how, terrific. So in this context, in the context of Indigenous women in the workforce, perhaps you can tell us what advice do you have for how we as a society can create lasting pathways and grow the capabilities of Indigenous businesses and individuals?
Well, the first thing I'll say is there's no silver bullet around this type of area. I think the first place organisations need to start with is really, you know, really unpacking the history and doing some truth telling around the history of this country. We all need to acknowledge and recognise that we're on Aboriginal land first and foremost, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the first people of this country. And you know, that the story has to start with that. I think unconscious bias is another area that is a kind of another foundational piece in helping organisations move forward, because we've got to, I don't know if we can completely eradicate bias, but we can help to mitigate it, and mitigate it, you know, in workplace settings. And where do we see that happen? In recruitment and in procurement. Two places, you know, you can have the old boys club, and we've always used that supplier, and it takes a huge cultural shift to change people's personal beliefs and their behaviours. And from a procurement perspective, their buying behaviour, you know, we've always procured this way, we've always used these particular suppliers. I think we've got to put the truth telling and the social impact into perspective, and it takes a real hearts and minds approach to do that. You got to get it up here, but you also have to get it in the heart and have a belief in the power of procuring from Indigenous businesses, and also by rising Indigenous women. You know, I've been a non-executive director of a number of boards and currently sit on a few boards. And too often I'm the only young Aboriginal woman that has a seat at that table, and we need that to change. And I really think that we've got to break down the unconscious bias and the preconceived conceptions, and really see the capabilities and the capacity, the skills and knowledge that exists, and the beauty of the diversity of Indigenous businesses and Indigenous women, and what they can actually bring to an organisation, how they can contribute and add lots and lots of value. There's a bit of a number that gets bounced around, and I don't want to sound too cliche in throwing it out there, but for every dollar you spend with an Indigenous business, you create $4.41 of economic and social value. And what that means, you know, I'm an Aboriginal woman, I'm in business, I've got a family. What that means is I'm a positive role model. I'm creating a generation of wealth creation for me, for my children, creating a legacy. It's pure self-determination, and it's a pathway for my kids to follow. And you are breaking down disadvantage, you're closing the gap. And, you know, it's just the right thing to do. If you're a good corporate citizen, it's the right thing to do.
Do you see that it's shifting? Because often you'd find there'd be a particular champion within organisations that were passionate about, you know, social enterprise, Indigenous businesses, and they'd be the ones pushing it. Are you seeing organisations change because they are seeing that this impact and this measurement, they can measure this up to the board and up to their strategies? Is it changing?
Yes and no. I think off the back of the Black Lives Matter movement last year that we did see a real reconnection and a bit of momentum because of that, about reconciliation. I think the organisations that get the most traction is where you've got the senior leadership support, and it starts at the top and it cascades through. We quite often get stuck with that frozen middle. There's these middle people that, you know, the bottom gets it, the top gets it, can't push through. But you've got to have the most senior person in an organisation. The CEOs, the managing directors need to be the ones that need to be driving and pushing and influencing. And where there's KPIs, key performance indicators in people's performance agreements and what they've got to work towards as an individual, you get greater buy-in as well. And it's I mean, it sounds like a tough stick when you say you've got to have things written into stuff like that, but you have to start somewhere, and sometimes you do have to use the heavy hand to push people into a space, and hopefully bring them on the cultural journey along the way as well.
And it speaks the language of business. If you're putting it in people's KPI, that, you know, that's how we speak. You do a strategy and then you have KPIs and targets to follow. Makes sense to me. Tanya, you've represented Australia's position at the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, a conference of the parties, and throughout the development of the Sustainable Procurement Guidelines. ISO 2400-217, there's all the numbers out. And you've developed and delivered greenfield sustainable procurement integration in telecommunications. You've led sustainability and sustainable procurement functions across 25 countries for well-known NGOs, and participated in federal government consultation to develop the Modern Slavery Act 2018, and co-authored the Global Eye Health Sustainable Strategy and high-level guidance for climate action. So with all that background, I'm interested in what is the role of social procurement in equity, diversion and inclusion space, the role of social procurement in EDI. Not a tough question.
Well, I was going to know that, because it's not the question. It's like, oh, I am as nerdy as I sound. So for me, when I started getting into sustainability was 2008, and I was only relatively fresh to procurement, and the interconnectedness of everything, whether it's business, personal, whether it's diversity and inclusion, climate change resilience and impacts, it is all interconnected. And I just didn't understand why people in procurement didn't get that, because to me it was just common sense and logic. And the role, so to begin with, we know we have a sustainable development goal specific to sustainable public procurement. And there's a reason why. It's because the multilaterals and you know, that level of government actually see the value in the lever that procurement delivers for change. So the role of social procurement to be able to deliver equitable opportunities and economic empowerment is, to me, so powerful. You know, we just heard Kristal talk about, I can't remember the different words that you use for economic empowerment, but that's a normal sustainability piece of language which you'll find in the ISO, etc. And that's because we have, and particularly women in procurement, why would you not be looking at Indigenous business and Indigenous women-owned business and women-owned business and businesses that are providing opportunities for social inclusion for people that identify with disabilities, because that is around how we create innovation. And something that's a challenge for one person is an opportunity for others. And as a business, that's how you start to, what Lisa was talking about, tap into the innovation, because, you know, as we all know and experience, much to our detriment, it's through adversity that we come up with better, more holistic ideas. And so for me, I think that they're inextricable. And if we add the climate change or climate resilience kind of lens, and this was really evident when I was working, supporting all the countries in Africa, Middle East and all through Asia, women and children are disproportionately affected by anything, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change impacts, whether it's about not having access to education because their role is to look after the home and look after the children. So therefore that's their first priority. So by having a focus on diversity, inclusion and equity or equality, we're actually starting to really hit more than just one particular focus of gender. We are looking at education, we are looking at, you know, life on land, we are looking at economic opportunity partnerships. It starts to literally build on that entire ecosystem. So that's a really long way of saying that I'm a big fan, and I absolutely think that social procurement can really deliver some positive change. And to touch on also the quota or the targets, KPIs, you know, you have a bit of a tension. It's like, why do we need to have KPIs and targets or goals? But without those, we don't actually encourage progress. And it's a normal part of business. Like, everybody has a KPI, you have targets that you're supposed to achieve as a part of what you do. Why would you not have that? And I know that from, you know, Indigenous business targets, there has been some challenges because right now the market might not have all of the Indigenous business availability to support those targets, but that means it's shifting and creating momentum to achieve that. And that's fantastic. And it's looking at partnerships to be able to develop that. And I think that's really exciting.
No, I totally agree. And targets are important. And, you know, once we've reached a certain level, then you may need to take targets away, but you've got to get to that level. And that includes with female representation in politics, in my opinion. I'm going to read out some more comments. Gordon, thanks for your comment. For me, it's sharing perspective, seeing things through the eyes, it's crucial. Others' eyes, it's crucial. Absolutely. Myrene says, hope soon we will not be celebrating International Women's Day annually because we achieved our goal and equality is embedded in our culture. Thank you. Now, I'm going to shift the dial a little bit. I don't know whether anyone's heard, but you know how often you're in a work environment, and I'm going to take it back a little bit and go, you know, how often in a work environment have you had a moment when it comprises in the majority of women speaking in that conversation? And with this question, I can't help but think of the Bechdel test, which is also known as the Bechdel-Wallace test. And basically this is a measure that shows the representation of women in fiction or in movies. And the assessment is based on whether or not the work that's being tested features at least two women, get it, who talk to each other about something other than a man. So that's the criteria. You think that wouldn't be hard. And yesterday I did find myself Googling, I have to say this, confession, I did find myself Googling my guilty pleasure Bridgerton, and it passes that test, by the way. So my question to Lisa is, how often have you been in a work environment where you've had a moment when women are involved in the majority of the discussion, and what has happened?
You know, I actually had a thought about this, and I couldn't, I had a thought, and I thought, you know, I've had so many amazing leaders in my career, and they've actually all been women. And I've had the pleasure of being able to shadow them when I'm, you know, and really learn and, you know, become and have them be my mentor. And in every conversation that I can recall with them, they have actually led the conversation. And even when say a male in that conversation thought they had the upper hand, you know, my leader has often used empathy or used one way or another to make them think they've got what they want, and actually walked out of that space getting exactly the outcome that they wanted. So I had a thought about it, and I tried to think of, you know, is there an example I can think of a woman that hasn't been has been shut down in a conversation? And I honestly couldn't think of one. And I'm not sure if that's because of the like Tanya said, the breadth of our age gap, and whether that's because I'm now a millennial and maybe things have just moved forward a lot in the workspaces that I've personally worked in. This is probably a lot different to a lot of other people, but yeah, that I've been very fortunate to work for some very strong female leaders that have actually taught me everything I've needed to learn so far. So yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. Before I go to Kristal for a comment, or Tanya for a comment, what I want to do is shout out to the 20 women, the women in procurement from the Kingdom of Tonga. That is amazing, and great to have you guys here today. So welcome to the conversation from the Kingdom of Tonga. Kristal, or Tanya, do you have anything to add around you know, this concept of all women talking, and what kind of a different conversation comes out? Go, Tanya.
Okay. Kristal first. Okay. Sorry about that, ladies. I must admit, a little bit like Lisa, I can only reflect on two very different workplaces. So, you know, before procurement, I was in IT, so I came from a very male heavy industry, and then going to health and NGO, which is very heavy female industry. So I don't, and also reflecting on my mentors, I've had pretty much balance between men and women, but I think perhaps the key difference is around active listening in participating in conversations. Women do tend to naturally make that space to actively listen if they don't have to compete for some airtime. And if it's one-on-one, then I think that it's a lot more of an inclusive and empathetic conversation. And it's not to say that it's emotional. It just means that people have the room to say what they need to or want to say and be in a safe environment. But it's also a little bit more positive language. But I think that that's perhaps, you know, corporate land, and that was a few years ago. So I'm hoping that, I don't think things have changed, but I'm hoping that things have a little bit in that space. But yeah, I think that it's just having the space to listen and to be heard.
Kristal?
I don't know if I've got anything of real value to add either. I kind of struggled with this question because, look, culturally, I come from a matriarchal line. I come from a long line of women. My mum is one of 10 with 7 sisters, and women take the forefront in my family. And women, Aboriginal women in general, are usually the backbone of our family and our society. I've just come out of a business where a very female dominated, was led by 3 Aboriginal women, and the majority of our staff were all women. I think there were 3 men. And prior to that, a lot of the workplaces I've worked in, my leaders have also been women. So I feel like there's always been a strong culture around women having a voice. And I feel like how that has helped me has really helped to continue to elevate my voice and to give me strength and confidence to use that. I agree with Tanya, you know, that we're active listeners. I also think we just have the ability to get shit done. And, you know, I think that's, I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but yeah, I feel like that's sort of the space that I've kind of been in. I mean, it's still really interesting. I was in a conversation yesterday in a workshop, and you know, talking and really trying to focus a particular agenda item around Aboriginal women. And one sole voice was there saying, well, where's the Aboriginal men in this conversation? And I was saying, well, we're not trying to take anything away from men, but can we not elevate Aboriginal women in this circumstance? So, yeah, it became a very interesting dialogue.
No, really interesting. And what you've all described is that you all had a space by being in these women-only spaces. You all had a space to speak your voice, and perhaps maybe that's where to gain confidence and be able to project, which leads nicely into my next question of Lisa. What advice do you give to finding your voice in meetings? And that is really, you know, what advice do you give to be listened to and to be heard in meetings, particularly as a millennial?
Yeah, you know, I think there's an art to finding your voice, and I think Kristal and Tanya did touch on it in terms of our ability to listen as well, as ironic as it sounds. But, you know, yeah, there is an art to finding your voice, specifically if you're the only female in the room, or the youngest in the room, or the only person of colour, which I know Kristal can relate to. I obviously can as well, being a combination of all three of things. But yes, I've had my fair share of challenges in this space, and a few of the things that have helped me become that has been, well, wherever I can or whenever I can, I do like to arrive slightly early if I don't know the people around the table. And I think you can network before the meeting begins, because if you introduce yourself to someone you haven't met before, it really helps you to find your voice when they know who you are and your purpose of being there, you know. It's something as little as, you know, my name's Lisa Strickland from the procurement team or something, you know, so they know why you're there and what value you're going to be adding to that conversation. And when you speak, I speak with conviction. You know, there's a reason why you're in the meeting. You're not there for decoration. So, you know, back yourself, and yeah, your ideas are valued. And if you don't understand something, I'm really big on asking questions, and I will ask questions the whole meeting if that's what it takes for me to understand what in the world they're talking about. And I think that's so important. Don't be afraid to ask questions, as many as you need to. And yeah, and I guess, yeah, and lastly is just knowing when to speak and when to listen, which I think females are very good at, because we listen not to respond, we listen because we want to understand. Well, that's been my observation in a way. So yeah, so those are some of the key things that I think are really valuable in terms of trying to be heard, and has worked for me. And like we've been discussing, it's so important to have that space created for us, and I've been really fortunate to have that through female leaders, and it's amazing to have this conversation and being on a panel with female leaders that are creating that space for other young women as well. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. So you've said, you know, have conviction, back yourself, ask questions, and know when to listen. So that's perfect. Thanks, Lisa. I'm going to read out some more comments. Rebecca Walker says, I'm imminently and hopefully going to be heading up a procurement and supply management function in financial services. I would love resources to be able to source diverse suppliers of the kind we need to engage. So is there a three-second answer you can give there, Kristal or Tanya?
So We Connect is an international women's business database, so recommend them. You know, we know Supply Nation, there's Indigenous Commerce, Chambers of Commerce, the social traders, there's more of those. And that's a great question, because as procurers, we're looking for being able to access quality information quickly. So the more databases there are, I know Giveable is a new platform which was started by two sisters that's working with procurement to deliver some of those solutions, so they're out there.
Thank you. Kristal, in your view, whose role is it to drive the conversation around the elephant in the room, the gender pay gap?
I reckon it's men. I think men have a role to play in inequality and in the gender pay divide, because, you know, 9 times out of 10, they're the person that's sitting at the other end of the table that's making the decisions. So I think that it's men have to embark on this conversation. They need to take a stand. They need to recognise that by, you know, offering women and giving women what they're entitled to of equal pay does not take anything away from them. It really just recognises our skills, our capabilities for doing exactly the same things that they do as well.
Mm. And Tanya, I love this quote that you've got on your bio: what you do makes a difference and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. Jane Goodall. And does this influence you and your view on whose role it is to drive the conversation around gender pay gap?
Oh, nice tie-in. So I think it's everyone's responsibility because, first of all, you know, how I've personally approached it is I ask. So you're not supposed to reveal your pay, but I ask my colleagues, and generally it's an unspoken secret that people understand where they're sitting. So, you know, do your bit of your research, and thank goodness we get, you know, I know CIPS partners with Hayes to produce a procurement salary guide. But on top of that, it's, as Kristal said, it's our management, which is often men, but may not be. It's our human resources or people and culture team, but it's also the CEO needs to take it seriously and to actually commit to publish it, because when we have that information easily accessible, it's a conversation that's not about dancing around going, I'm not sure, I think this is where it's at, or I'm not supposed to know, which is also a strange thing, not supposed to know. So by publishing equity pay reports annually is really helpful, because it does gives you a basis of fact for the conversation. But, you know, to reiterate Lisa's point, back yourself. Have the courage to ask.
Thank you. Yeah. Terrific. I'm going to throw to some of the questions from the audience, if that's okay, panel. Alice Bray asks, and this is whoever wants to jump in first, what are you seeing in each of your field? What have you got? What are you seeing in each of you of your fields time and time again that doesn't seem to have enough attention on it in terms of women and representation? What are you seeing in each of your fields that time and time again doesn't seem to have enough attention in terms of women and representation? Do you have a thought for solutions or opportunities to solve them? What are you seeing over and over again? Good question, Alice.
It is a really good one. I think, if I can just jump in there, I mean, I just don't think we see enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in senior leadership roles across the board. I think where you do see women rise, it tends to be in something that's specific Indigenous. And so we get pigeonholed into Indigenous-centric stuff, where we have leadership abilities and capabilities and skills and knowledge that we can lead anything. And so that's, you know, I want to see more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women sitting at the board at some of our ASX 200 companies. I want to see it across the board, across government, in senior roles. Yeah.
And how do you?
And can I just say, I was going to say my thoughts completely aligned with that. I mean, we're in a position now where women are the most educated and in the best place they possibly can be to, you know, finally break that glass ceiling. But how many of them are we seeing that are people of colour, if minority backgrounds in terms of ethnicity and women? So yeah, that's a very good point that Kristal's raised. Completely relate to that.
Thank you.
If I may, I think there's just one extra piece to that, and sustainability, the more I'm seeing conversations around sustainability, integration, and actually embedding that within organisations, these conversations are much easier because opportunity, equity, viability, all of those things are core components of sustainability. So actually, and we know that, you know, new staff are looking for organisations that actually have those ethics in place and hold themselves accountable. And I also think that as the older generations drop off and drop out of management, it's also making the job easier.
You've done a nice shift there, Tanya, to generations. And I'd like to ask all three of you, what is the biggest challenge for the generation of the women behind you? Lisa, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I just want to say, you know, women have time and time again proven their capabilities in the work front, but still the top cream layer is mostly occupied by men, right? So I think the challenge of the next generation is really the lack of visibility of female leaders and role models or mentors out there. You know, when women try and look for leaders who they can emulate, they're often left behind. So I think there's something in that for the next generation of women. And I think it's a challenge as well to my generation, the generations before me, to really be visible and be that beacon for the next generation.
Following along from that you can't be what you can't see. Absolutely. Thanks, Lisa. Well, we can see you and we're glad you're a leader, so thank you. Kristal, what about you?
I echo Lisa's challenge. I think we've got a bit of work to do, you know, coming through COVID. I think there's been a lot of blurring of the roles for women, and we're tended to, I guess, not take a step back, but be pulled back in a lot of instances because of the environment that we've been working through, you know, and there's an unbalancing between the work and your home life, and that work-home balance because of COVID. And I feel like that's still going to take us some time to make that shift. Women have carried the burden of educating kids and working from home all through this COVID time. And I do see that's continuing to be something as we go into the future that we're going to have to unblur. And women, as Lisa said, getting that visibility and really being able to push through that.
Thanks, Kristal. Tanya.
I was going to say, nice. It's such a lovely panel. You know, both of what the ladies have said, I couldn't agree with more. But I also think that the gig economy is going to, as we shift towards more of a gig economy, there's actually quite a few challenges in that, because ensuring employee protection, irrespective of how you're engaged as an employee. And there's benefits for women because it provides that flexibility to juggle, you know, your personal life, or if you've got multiple businesses or what. But I think the gig economy is something to watch, and we need to make sure that there are protections in place for employees, irrespective of the type of employee. Because everybody deserves sick leave, everybody deserves a universal basic wage, and I think that's a really important point. Aside from that, it's just juggling. I'm hoping that, you know, we're going to have these wonderful options, because this conversation has changed what is the norm, and it's about what do you choose? That's what I hope is the biggest challenge for women moving forward. Yeah.
Too many opportunities. Love it. Now we're almost coming to an end, almost the end of the hour, but what I want everyone on the panel and in the audience to think about what it is, what's your pledge? What pledge are you going to make to choose to challenge in the campaign for International Women's Day. So please use the chat area to make your pledge in the Choose to Challenge campaign for International Women's Day. And now I'm going to go to my panellists for our last question. Lisa, maybe you'd like to start. What's your pledge in the Choose to Challenge?
You know, my pledge actually links back to our discussion just then was, you know, challenge myself to be visible and heard for the next generations. And I like to pass that challenge out to every other woman out there as well. I think it's so important for us all to be visible and heard, you know, challenge yourselves to take up the opportunities and yeah, get out there, put yourself out there.
Thank you. Kristal.
I'm going to call out corporate tokenism and how it relates to the engagement of Indigenous people within workforces and supply chain. I think yeah, a lot of tokenism that happens, particularly on reconciliation action plans. And I think that there's still a lot more that people can do to genuinely show their commitment versus it being a tick and flick exercise.
Thank you. Tanya.
My personal pledge for my cousin who we lost yesterday, Kimberly, is that I will always use my platform to give all of the women that I possibly can an opportunity to shine, to give you a hand up to wherever you need to be and to listen to so that you always feel heard. That's my pledge.
Thank you, Tanya. Sammy's pledge on the chat, my pledge is as an Aboriginal woman is to increase supplier diversity within my realm. Thank you, Sammy. And my pledge, like Tanya, is to make sure I support and tap other women on the shoulders to say, take that speech, go to that forum, be that representative and take that job, because you need someone to support you and perhaps point you in the right direction and give you a bit of confidence and back them as well as backing yourselves. I can't say how proud I am of you all today. You've been fantastic, and I will just give you two more pledges. One's come in from Alice. Alice pledged to challenge representation across all groups I'm involved on and to reach across the sector to give women everywhere a platform. Thank you, Alice. And Jo pledges to challenge myself to be visible, challenge tokenism, challenge to support others. And she says, love it, ladies. And I love it, ladies, too. Thank you so much for your time today. Not only your time, your raw and your honest and your open conversation. You've given us all a lot to think about. And I think there is a lot of optimism. There's a lot of work to do. But together, I know we can most certainly make a difference. So thanks again to Kristal, to Tanya, to Lisa, and to Sophia, who directed and produced today's webinar, and to all women, all of those who support women and choose to challenge. We thank you. And before you go, our next webinar is on March the 19th at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and the topic is poverty in the it's not poverty, it's property in the post-COVID era. Fireside chat with the experts. Please join us and register by visiting our events page. Thank you again. I hope you all found it insightful, but before you leave, please take the time to fill out our survey so we can do a better job next time. Thank you.